Today we're going to talk about a teen who lived in the walls of a family home and terrorized them. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings in the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss video upload. Let's get started. In 1986, Brian Andrews had just become a single parent to his daughters, 15-year-old Annie and 8-year-old Jessica. The girl's mother had actually died from cancer. The family was living in Massachusetts, and now that Brian was a single parent, he had to work significantly longer hours to support the girls. And although he wasn't around as much as he'd like to be for his daughters, who were still very much grieving the loss of their mother, the girls were very close to each other, and losing their mother at such a young age only brought them closer. Annie, who was 15, had started talking about boys, and of course she was in that age where she wanted to start dating. And then one day Annie received a phone call from a boy. The boy would say, "My name's Danny and I received your number from a mutual friend at school." And these two would have phone conversations, and Danny would say that he was tall and blonde and athletic. And although Annie felt a little strange about all of this, she did go along with it. Danny and Annie would speak over the phone pretty much every day over the next week, and Annie enjoyed talking to him. So when he asked her to go on a date, she was thrilled. So one day Danny goes to pick up Annie and he arrives, and Annie opens the door and she's shocked by what she sees. He wasn't this athletic, blonde, handsome guy that he described himself as. In fact, he was 5'8", he had this greasy, dark hair and untamed eyebrows, and his skin was just riddled with acne. So of course Annie is shocked and surprised by this, but she tries not to let on. She was a very sweet girl, and she didn't want to make Danny uncomfortable. She felt that maybe he was a little insecure and that's why he lied. So Annie goes on the date with him, and she's trying really hard to have a nice time, and she's telling Danny about her mother and how she died of cancer. And apparently Danny just began bombarding Annie with questions about her mother's death. And this included asking Annie how badly her mother had suffered. And obviously Annie is grieving the loss of her mother, and this was just absolutely devastating, and it made her very uncomfortable. And only an hour later, Annie had had enough of this date. She told Danny that she had to go and that she didn't want to hear from him again. And then several days later, Annie and Jessica were at home and they were talking about their mother, and so they decided to actually have a seance in their basement. They wanted to try to get in contact with their mother and just tell her that they love her and just feel connected one more time. Although nothing strange happened during the seance, the sisters would actually start hearing knocking on their walls of their bedrooms. So the sisters believed that maybe this was their mother trying to communicate with them, but it continued to happen, and they started to fear that maybe during that seance they invited something scary into their home. And this knocking would continue at all times of day. At nighttime, it would wake them up and terrify them. It would just non-stop. It just came at the worst times, and it was just terrifying to them. Items would begin missing from the home, and the girls would come home from school and their bedroom furniture would be rearranged. Annie and Jessica would tell their father about the seance and all the things that were happening. And Brian was like, "Okay, but none of these things are happening to me, and maybe it's just their imagination, and they're obviously still grieving the loss of their mother and they're kind of fixated on this." So he didn't take it too seriously. One evening when the girls were home alone, the tapping had started again, but this time it sounded like it was coming from below them. So Annie and Jessica went to investigate. So they made their way down to the basement, and when they arrived, they found a message written in what looked like blood. It said, "I'm in your room, come find me." They were absolutely terrified. They ran from their house and they ran to the neighbors, who called their father and let them stay there until he arrived home. Obviously, when Brian got home, he went and checked it out and realized it was ketchup, and he kind of assumed that the girls had been doing this. He thought that they were maybe crying out for attention because he was working so much, and they were really stressed about obviously losing their mother. And then 2 weeks after this incident occurred, the knocking began again while the girls were home alone. And when the girls investigated, there was another message written on Annie's bedroom wall. It said, "I'm back, find me if you can." Obviously, the girls ran back to their neighbor's house and they told them what happened. Obviously, the neighbor was super sympathetic to these girls who had lost their mom, and their dad was working on the time. So the neighbor invited the girls in and said, "Come in and call your father." So of course they call Brian, and he's listening to them and he's a bit irritated, but he comes home from work anyways. So the girls are obviously at the neighbor's house. He goes inside, and apparently the volume on the TV is all the way up. It's blaring through the house, and this kind of gives him an eerie feel. So he goes up, he opens Annie's door, and he sees the writing on the wall. And then he also noticed there was another writing on the wall that said, "Marry me." So he didn't know if it was there when they fled the house and they had forgotten because they were so scared, or if it was written after they left the house. And as he's standing there and he's studying these walls, he's really coming to believe that something is going on in this house. And then out of the corner of his eyes, he sees something, and he turns around, and in the hallway he sees a scrawny boy standing there. The boy had this makeup cake caked onto him, and he was wearing a blonde wig and a dress that belonged to the girl's mother. And in this boy's hand was a hatchet. Some reports say that this boy was wearing the mother's wedding dress, but that hasn't been substantiated. Apparently, Brian Andrews and this boy get into a struggle, and he had to fight him off, and he flees the house, and he goes and he calls the police. And eventually the police arrive, and Brian is recounting all of this stuff, and they go in the house and they can't find this boy. And then one officer eventually notices something quite interesting. In Annie's room, there's a gap between the wall and a built-in cabinet. And when they pulled that cabinet away from the wall, they would find Daniel Laplante crouched in a crawl space. And as they're investigating this crawl space, they realize that he has been living there for weeks. He even went as far as carving holes into places so that he could spy on the family. So in October of 1987, Danny was actually taken in police custody and put in a juvenile detention center. Daniel really had a miserable childhood. He lived with his mother and stepfather and his two brothers. He was apparently abused physically, psychologically, and sexually by his stepfather and his father. He did have dyslexia, so he did suffer a bit academically, and he really didn't have any friends. People found him weird and strange and a bit creepy, and apparently he would come to class smelling bad and wearing dirty clothing, so his classmates did avoid him. Apparently during his teen years, he was sent to a psychiatrist, and during this time, the psychiatrist actually began to sexually abuse him. And of course, this only made his mental health even worse. So in October of 1987, obviously he was placed in the juvenile facility, but it was later transferred to adult court. He was going to be charged as an adult, which means he could post bail now. And his mother actually did help to bail him out of jail. On December 11th of 1987, he was supposed to actually appear in court, but he never showed up. And during this time, he actually broke into a neighbor's home, and instead of obviously torturing them like he had the Andrews girls, he stole 2 handguns. Daniel would walk half a mile from his home and would wind up at the home of the Gustafson home. This family would include 33-year-old Priscilla, her husband, 34-year-old Andrew, and their 2 children, 7-year-old Abigail and 5-year-old William. And Priscilla was pregnant with the couple's 3rd child at the time. On this day, Andrew had gone to work, Priscilla and William were home. Abigail had actually been at school, but she always took the bus back home and would walk the short distance to her house when she was dropped off. Daniel would break into the home, and he would drag Priscilla to her bedroom where he raped her and beat her. He would then put a pillow over her head and shot through it twice, killing the 34-year-old mother of 2. He would then drown William, who was 5 years old, in the bathroom upstairs. And then when the unsuspecting Abigail arrived home from school, she was drowned in the bathtub downstairs. And when Andrew would arrive home from work that evening at around 5 p.m., he noticed that the house was very quiet, which was obviously quite eerie because his 2 children should be home by now with his wife, and he would always come into a lively house. And after Andrew found his wife dead and witnessed this horrifying crime scene, he ran from the house to a neighbor's home and called the police. He just couldn't look for his children on his own. When police arrived and did a search, they not only found the 2 children, but a whole host of evidence. They found .22 caliber bullet casings, an untouched can of beer, they found semen stains and footprints in the flower bed outside of the home. Of course, police didn't know who would do this. The family had no enemies, but they did put together a suspect list, and Daniel had actually been on this list because he was just released from juvenile detention and was obviously due to appear in court, and they knew what he had done to the Andrews family. And because there's items missing from the home, Daniel had been known to commit robberies, so they zeroed in on him and began to question him. He only lived a mile from this family home, and on the next day, police found him at the public library, and they questioned him, and he said, "I was at home all day watching TV, and then I attended my niece's birthday party." And police didn't have any evidence at the time to arrest him. Eventually, later that day, they would go back to his home to question him further, and he was on the porch, so when police approached, he actually took off and bolted into the woods. So obviously, he books it into the woods, and they have to release this all points bulletin saying that, this is a suspect, we're looking for him, be on the lookout for him. And obviously, a manhunt starts, and they use a helicopter, and they had like 50 local police officers involved. Eventually, Daniel would abduct a woman by gunpoint and make her drive him around in her Volkswagen van. She did manage to escape and call the police and report her vehicle stolen, and she told them what happened, so they did know that he was probably still driving that vehicle because he really wasn't all that careful when committing crimes. So obviously, the police told everyone to be on the lookout. They told the community if they seen anything suspicious to call in, and this would actually be the reason that Daniel was found. At around 6:30 p.m. on December 3rd, Daniel was actually found hiding in a dumpster at a lumber yard because the public had reported sightings of him. They did arrest Daniel apparently without incident, but he would not stop laughing. He was laughing hysterically as he was being arrested, and they would find a gun in his underwear. And obviously, he was arrested and charged with the murder of the family. Obviously, they had the gun now. They had a pair of Converse shoes that matched matched the garden prints. They actually found a sock with saliva on it, and that saliva belonged to Priscilla. They had found stolen things from the home, and they also found a thumbprint, which belonged to Daniel. He was forced to undergo a psychiatric evaluation, and he was pronounced competent to stand trial. And although he was a minor at the time of the murders, he was being tried as an adult. And the entire time throughout the trial, Daniel was just an absolute nightmare. He was smiling. He really had no remorse for his actions. He just looked absolutely evil. After 5 hours of deliberation, he was found guilty on all charges and obviously sentenced to life in prison. Daniel would actually have the opportunity to apply for parole after serving 45 years, and that would be in the year 2032. And obviously, I think we can all agree that he should remain in prison for the rest of his life. But that's it for today. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. If there's a case you'd like me to cover, pop it in the comments and I'm going to get to as many of them as possible. See you next time.